Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we continue to take our look back at the 23-24 season, look ahead to the upcoming season, what the Bucks need to do in the offseason, and pick the brain of Brian Sampson, who you know on Twitter as Bucks Film Room. We get into that conversation coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia here with you, joined by Camille Davis. You can find her work on the Pack a Day podcast, on the Technical Foul podcast, before you know it, on the Carry the G in MKE podcast. You can hear me on the Bucks Radio Network, and you can find our guest as well, Brian Sampson, on Twitter at Bucks Film Room, and to his podcast as well. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find it on YouTube as well as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Mentioned we have a guest, and again, you can find him on Twitter at Bucks Film Room. You can find his podcast with the same title as well, Brian Sampson. So, Brian, I guess we'll start here. 8 months ago, when the Bucks made the trade to acquire Damian Lillard? I guess we'll go all the way back to then. Your immediate thoughts when you heard that trade was made, the Bucks acquiring Damian, and what it would mean for the Bucks that upcoming season.
Yeah, initially I thought they were a great fit, right? Like we talked about, or Giannis had said, afraid of his Giannis or Dame, but if they had one player that they could pick to play with, it was the other guy. And so on paper, that looked like a great partnership, the pick and roll duo, really unlocking all levels of the court. Then you throw Chris Middleton in there and the damage he can do in the mid-range. And it really seemed like Milwaukee had all three levels of the court locked in as far as the ability to score from them and score from them efficiently. Unfortunately, it just never played out that way because of just a constant season of turmoil. I think everybody is pretty well aware at this point of everything they went through, but I was excited right away. I thought that was a great partnership. Both players, are very unselfish and are dedicated to the game and have high basketball IQs. I thought it was going to work right away from the get-go. I would assume that if you went back and listened or looked at what I had written down, that I didn't think there'd be really much of an adjustment period at all. I thought they would just be ready to get up and running from the get-go.
So just a quick question for you with that, because as we saw throughout the season that this fit wasn't as clean or seamless as we thought that it might be. You mentioned, of course, the different turmoils. They had to learn how to play with each other under Adrian Griffin and then again under Doc Rivers. But from what you were watching between the fit with Giannis and Dame, what about it seemed off to you? And what do you think they have to continue to work on just to really grow that pairing to be what we all thought that it would be when we heard that Dame was coming to Milwaukee initially?
I think a lack of clarity. I think we just go back to that of just neither player or the whole team really knew what was expected of them and had to find their way. I think the loss, I think back to Terry Stotts. I think that was a huge loss. That was a guy who we saw a lot of different stuff in the preseason as far as things that he had ran with Dame and things that were successful, and to lose him shortly before the season began, I think just through the whole operation in flux from the get-go is all right. All of a sudden they had tailored their offense one way. We're getting ready. I think they're running a lot of Highhorn sets, a lot of different things like that Stotts had implemented in Portland. And then that had to switch at the last minute, or at least some of it had to. So I really think back to lack of clarity. And Doc Rivers had said one of the first things that he did when he got there was went to each player and said, here's what I'm expecting of you. And all the players were like so shocked and so appreciative. But I think like that should just be normal practice, right? A new coach comes in, and obviously I don't know anything that happened behind the scenes, so I can't speak to all of that, but what did and what did not happen. But to answer your question, Camille, I think it's really just that lack of clarity of where were guys supposed to be, how are they supposed to play on ball, but how are they supposed to play off ball, and where do those rotations come from? The Knicks game that's going on right now with the Pacers are getting torched by Jalen Brunson, but they can't double him, because as soon as they double him, whoever is doubling him, his man runs to right to the nail, and then all of a sudden that's the outlet for a quick 3-on-2. So like they know right where they're supposed to be. I don't think Milwaukee ever had that going for them.
Those you mentioned those high horns that they would run. We saw that. Was it the Knicks game? We saw it a lot in one early game, the preseason as well, and then it just kind of died. Where you saw it sometimes throughout the season, but not what we saw in the first 10 or so games. And in hindsight, the Terry Stotts abrupt departure was the canary in the coal mine that I think a lot of us tried to rationalize, and we wondered and speculated too. I think I talked about it on this show. I talked with people that were there at that shoot around in practice and said, I didn't even see what happened. So I don't know what this was that you wondered. Well, I don't know. Maybe it was a personality clash. Maybe it was Terry Stotts that was just accustomed to being a head coach and now having to accept the role where he's not the guy. But, in hindsight and evaluating everything that went down that first half of the season, that really was the tell that structure is what was missing. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, I'm with you, and I think all of us are, Brian, that I didn't think this would be that much of a transition. I thought it would be seamless for Giannis and Dame to pair together, but all the change that happened this season, not just the acquisition of Dame, the coaching changes. Terry Stotts gone, a new head coach, Joe Prunty back on the sidelines for 3 games as the head coach. If we take a step back, it was never going to be this season for the Bucks for all of those reasons. And I've talked about this before. They're a super team. You don't have Giannis and Dame and say you're not a super team. It very seldom works out in the first year with super teams. So I think there are some positive things to point to and say, hey, this will get better. We saw the defense make some strides. It's going to have to continue to make some more. And that was one of the big messages that Doc Rivers delivered at the end of the season. But that a full off season with Doc, a full training camp with him, more chemistry with Giannis and Dame. That duo had said they're going to spend some time together this offseason. Doc even questioned, I don't know why they weren't doing that before. So all these things point to, hey, it should be better next season. But I think the challenge there is, as we'll get to, is, it should be better, but that also may be the last year you have this group together, an aging roster, and you look at the roster construct and player salaries, next year may be it. So that is a lot of pressure to put on this team of, hey, okay, we're willing to give you a pass. There was a lot of moving parts. We know it'll be better, but it better be better because this is it.
Yeah, everybody, I think, I shouldn't say everybody. Outside of their big 3, I think they're going to have to make some very hard decisions with their roster this year. With Brook Lopez, I thought for the first time he took a step backward in his career. I thought last year he was fine. Like you couldn't really tell a huge drop off. But this year, I think you could kind of see some of that. And he had a lot more responsibilities on his shoulder this year too, right? No Drew Holiday to keep guys in front of him. He was cleaning up a lot of the mess. So I think they're going to have to make hard decisions on Brook Lopez, on Bobby Portis, on Pat Connaughton, on a lot of these guys to really explore that market in a way that maybe they haven't realistically done, because BP is up for a contract extension as well this offseason. So if they're not going to sign him to a larger deal, you would think that it would make more sense for them than to explore the trade market, because he's probably going to want a deal he's probably going to want a new deal if they want to show that they're committed to him. So you run that risk as well. And so I think that they have a lot of tough decisions that really will shape their future. And you talked about how it was year 1 of the super team, but this is kind of also going to be year 1 because they didn't have, how many games did Middleton, Dame, and Giannis play? They only brought Doc Rivers in the second half or later part of the season. So this is kind of like year 1.5 with this new team.
So throwing water on it already.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It was what, 6 games, I think, since
6
Doc arrived
and 4.
that they played full, together.
Yeah, they had a few where they all started, but somebody left the game. I think there was like 8 or 9 games where they were all together, but 2 or 3 they didn't finish, but it was 6 total that they played together. And Brian, that's a great point. Me and Justin were talking about that on yesterday's episode as well. Just like this offseason is going to be big for this team, and it should be a bit better because they have more clarity. They know who the coach is going to be. Doc Rivers has mentioned how he's going to be sending them actions he wants them to run, things he wants them to work on. And like you said, this is kind of like, we call it like an audit year with Doc Rivers with the Bucks, because coming in halfway through the year, you don't have much time to really implement things the way that you want it to be ran. Doc Rivers came in, and honestly, from my perspective, he just came and tried to clean up some of that low-hanging fruit. Like, hey, you guys are doing this really wrong. Let's clean this up. Transition defense, let's clean this up. Let's try to get more clarity and more structure on what we're running, and go from there. So now in the offseason, it seems like they'll have time to build around that. But to your point about the Bucks having to make some difficult decisions, I just have to say first, I'm glad that you didn't say like, hey, outside like the big threes, they can be traded too, because that's we've heard that a lot from some Bucks fans saying Chris Middleton should still be traded, so on and so forth. I'm of the same train of thought of thinking the big three with Dame, with Chris, with Giannis should come back, but try to figure out decisions with some of the other guys on the roster, what you want to do, because there are some young guys too who the Bucks have on their roster who fans have been clamoring to see more of, and they might have a big opportunity to do that next season.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say, with those young guys, I think that's I agree about the big three, especially the way Middleton played, the way Dame played in the playoffs. Like that big three, you don't touch that. You're good there. The young guys, I think that's maybe where I veer off a little bit from general fans, as far as I need to see something from some of those guys before I want to put them on the court. I call it, I don't know if this is an actual thing, but it's like the backup quarterback syndrome, right? Of, all right, you have your starter, you see what he is. He's not special. He doesn't get you excited, but here's this backup that you've heard about in practice that maybe has flashed in the preseason, and all of a sudden you want him to be the starter. I feel like because the Bucks roster has continued to get older and older, fans, we've kind of really gotten into that. Oh, we want the young guys to play because they're young and they could be good. We don't know if they're good, but they might be. And so I think the Bucks do have something in AJ Green and Andre Jackson Jr. with limitations. AJ Green is probably going to be your 15-minute a night guy. He's not going to be somebody you're going to want to count on for 20 to 25 minutes, but 15 minutes every night. I think he's proven that he deserves every opportunity to play that. I would put Andre Jackson Jr. maybe in that same boat. Maybe you can flirt with him playing a few more minutes if he can stay out of foul trouble, but his foul rate was incredibly high last year, and his steals rate was incredibly low. Like, you would think a guy who's fouling that much would at least be gambling, playing aggressive, getting steals, but that wasn't the case. So he needs to clean that up. Beauchamp is my biggest concern. I don't know that he has it. I don't think that Bucks should count on him in their future. I think that the other guys know their roles, know how to fit in, what's expected of them. I think he wants to play a larger role than what Milwaukee needs from him. So that would just be the young guy of those three that I'm most hesitant about. But I think AJ Green and Ajax, they should be in the rotation to begin the year and given every opportunity next season.
I do want to get into the young guys in much more detail here coming up after the break. And one thing that I saw you talking about on Twitter earlier today, when the exact thing you mentioned there about the roster getting younger and what that's potentially going to mean. So we'll get into that conversation coming up here after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, this next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by BetterHelp. And look, we just came past Mother's Day weekend. It can be a very stressful time for a lot of us. If you're playing in the playoffs and listening to the show, that's a huge stressor as well, especially in those clutch minutes of games. But stressors, big or small, can be different and come from different spots for everyone. When we keep those things bottled up, it can start to affect all of us negatively. Therapy is a safe space to get those things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever is weighing you down. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, when we talk about this roster getting younger, and I talked about this on one of our final post-game shows of the year, because that was really what seemed to come in the most in terms of listener interactions. Hey, this team has to get younger and more athletic. I'm 50% of the way there with you. They clearly need to get more athletic. They need some more playmakers. Everybody needs bigger wings. The Bucks are certainly no different. The challenge, though, is what you kind of hinted at, and that is getting younger. Look, it would be nice to get an infusion of youth, but when you're where the Bucks are, you don't all of a sudden make your roster 50% young guys and 50% Giannis and Dame and Chris Middleton. That's just not how it works. And I saw you mentioning something similar earlier in the day on Twitter as well. As it's kind of the approach you have to take is one in, one out. So if you think Andre Jackson Jr. is a guy that maybe it's a 20-minute guy that we can lean on heavily, okay, he takes one of those spots. Maybe that means that first round pick is dangled and packaged with something else as a trade, because you're not going to see this team carrying 5 or so guys like that, like Andre and AJ, Marjan, if he's on the team, and a draft pick or two. That's just not how this is going to work with this team.
Yeah, I think that's something Milwaukee's going to have to figure out. And I think so. When I tweeted that, is that what it's called, or posted? I don't know what it's called anymore, but
We still say tweets over here.
yeah, okay. I think I miscounted, because Milwaukee already has 4 young guys, right? They have Green, Ajax, Beauchamp, and Chris Livingston. And
Yep.
so you're already almost a fourth of your roster. You don't need 6 guys or 5 guys on this roster who are young guys, unproven in the NBA. So that's where I think, they have the 23rd and the 33rd pick. If they're going to use one of those and keep a player, great, fine. But then that means one of those other guys is probably going to be gone, because I think Jay Crowder is probably gone. I think they'll try to bring back Pat Bev. Like, there's already few roster spots. Probably replace the Thanasis spot since he got hurt now. But I think that's like the last thing they need is 6 out of their 15 roster spots to be young guys, plus their 2-way roster spots as well. So I think that'll really be something that they'll have to figure out with how does that roster construction work.
Yeah. That's a great point, because one thing too, you even mentioned like Malik Beasley, a guy who probably not coming back to Milwaukee this year after playing on that minimum. He was looking to get a bigger payday, part of why he came to Milwaukee in the first place. So theoretically, like, the Bucks have an opening starting 2-guard spot. Like, who can that be? We've theorized, like, could AJ Green step into that spot after a summer of work, so on and so forth. But to your point, I think when people are talking about wanting to get younger and go through those growing pains, sometimes the growing pains part of it is the annoying part that people don't really want to go through. And when you have a team like the Bucks are constructed, where it's like, we're here for championships, that's why vets tend to get leaned on a little bit heavier, because it's a trust factor in there. It's you've already shown us you can perform in this situation. We understand that, and we're trying to achieve these goals. So let's get to it. But I am really curious, because the Bucks do have 4 different young guys on the roster: the Marjan, the Chris Livingston, the AJ Green, the Andre Jackson Jr. Like, this summer, like, I think 1 or 2, like 2, of course, would be great if they could pop, but like, the Bucks are going to need at least one of them to really come on strong for this team next season. And prediction time, we don't know at this point. We still have to see Summer League. We still have to see what they actually do in the draft, so on and so forth. But really quick, if you had to pick one of the young guys, which one do you think is most likely to find themselves in that rotation spot? Are you leaning AJ Green? I know you mentioned Green and Jackson Jr. as the 2 who you're already the highest on, but between those 2, which one do you think has a greater shot at playing some meaningful minutes next season?
I'm going to give the politician answer of, I think AJ Green's the safe answer because we've seen it, but I think Andre Jackson Jr. has the higher ceiling. He has the bigger chance. So I'm feeling risky. I'm going to go Ajax, because I think that Doc Rivers can tell him what he wants from him next year, and Ajax can go and prepare that. That was really a different type of player that Milwaukee brought in, right? Under Budenholzer, they would have gone for a shooter, a 6'6" guy who can shoot it. So I think an offseason where he can craft his game specifically to what Doc Rivers wants. So I'm going to go with him. I think he has the highest chance. Like I said at the beginning, AJ Green, you really don't want to play him more than 15 minutes consistently. I think with Andre Jackson Jr., if he can improve on a couple of things, he can play more minutes than 15. I do want to say one thing that Milwaukee needs to avoid this season is just getting younger. I don't think that's a skill that teams build around, right? Like no team has ever been successful because they're young. I think there are attributes that come with youth, like athleticism, like speed, like different things like that Milwaukee will and should target. But I don't think their goal should be to get younger. Their goal should be to get better, and through getting better, byproduct might be them getting younger. Just a little pet peeve that I battle with people on Twitter of like, no, you don't just want to get younger, you want to get better.
Or at least say more athletic.
Yeah. I'm with you on Ajax would seem to be the guy. I think a lot of us, I don't know if you were in this camp, Frank admitted he was. A lot of us were more than pleasantly surprised by AJ Green this year, that I think his defense improved, where he's not going to kill you out there, his ability to shoot. But to your point, you think about like Duncan Robinson and how the Heat had used him in recent years, where it's probably 15 or so minutes. You pick and choose your spots depending on who the other team has on the floor, where you can hide him a little better. That's probably a little harsh to say, but that seems like that's the ceiling for AJ, and that's not a bad thing. That's a rotational player. Andre just popped when he's on the floor. The fouls need to come down. I think the challenge too, and this goes back to some of the things Camille and I talked about with Giannis, is, it's even more going to be a challenge of finding the right lineups for Andre Jackson Jr. to be on the floor. He can certainly play when Dame and Chris are out there. If it's just Andre and Giannis out there, that's where you're going to have challenges when you don't have as many shooters, because teams are going to say, even if it's a corner three, we'll let this guy take them all day. We don't think he's going to be able to make them. But it's undeniable what he brings with his athleticism. And, you watch the teams that are still left in the playoffs. You see teams that are picking guys up 94 feet and playing with that intensity. It's just not the way that the Bucks are constructed at this moment as a veteran team. And that's, one spot where you can get it is from Andre.
Yeah, I think that with Damian Lillard, that spacing is a little bit less important than when they had Drew Holiday. And I would say the other thing is teams win all the time without having 5 shooters. Obviously, Giannis can help that a little bit, but Andre Jackson Jr., I think that next step would be figuring out how to go dunker spot to dunker spot, how to cut off ball. Miami Heat, they killed the Bucks in the last playoffs by attacking on the strong side, and then they would always loop a guy in and curl on the weak side for open dunks and layups. Like, I think there are some ways, but I agree with your point of he needs to figure out a way to make himself a weapon on offense, because I think a lot of times this season he just was disinterested in the basket, and then teams had even less of a reason to guard him.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just one quick Andre Jackson Jr. thought as well that I remember him mentioning about in college, he played a lot on ball where he was initiating offense. So one thing with his rookie year was learning to play a little bit more off ball in an NBA system as well. So I think having this summer with understanding of what is expected of him will also do him wonders, to your point, Brian, about that. So I did want to throw it out there because that was a jarring difference from him going from college to the NBA, just learning how to be off ball more. And he has to learn how to become more of a threat off ball as well.
Yeah. And the Bucks just need more ball handlers. We saw that in that series against the Pacers. I mean, no Dame and no Giannis are contributing factors, but aside from that, it was basically Pat Beverly and the few moments where Andre was on the floor that you were looking at, these guys can bring the ball up the floor. That's about it. So having as many of those safety valves as you can get is going to be big. The one other quick thing I do want to throw out there before we take our last break here is you mentioned the name of Chris Livingston. I didn't get a chance to see much of him in the G League. You would just take a look at the numbers and see what he was doing. And hearing from people within the organization that he was turning some heads there, the caveat is, look, it's the G League. We've seen other guys light up the G League, notably players like Christian Wood, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the NBA level. But I don't know if I'm crazy. There's just something about Chris Livingston, and maybe it's the simple fact of we said you need more bigger athletic wings to throw out there defensively. This guy fits the mold. The offense is still a work in progress. But he's the guy I think I am most interested to see what his progression is next season.
Yeah, it's hard for me to talk with him or about him because I haven't seen other than those garbage time minutes, which
Yeah.
again comes with the same kind of caveat that you had shared. I think that's interesting. I debate whether or not did Milwaukee see something in him, or is that kind of a bone for his agent drafting him in that spot? And I think we'll find out because what he signed a 3-4 year contract. So, and he's came out after 1 year as well. So I think that we'll find out. Like Milwaukee will give him every chance to come in and compete. Maybe he still needs another year of seasoning, but it will be interesting to see what kind of leap he can make because he does bring that athleticism factor that Milwaukee is missing. So I think that's just another kind of lottery ticket to see, what he can do or what he can bring to the table.
All right, we got to take one more break here. When we come back, some thoughts going into the offseason and next season. We already kind of touched on, is this the last run? Is this the last season for this group together? And high-level picture, what are the big things other than what we've already touched on the Bucks need to improve upon and do in this offseason? We'll get into that conversation after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, time to talk to you about our friends over at GameTime. I've talked about using GameTime before when I was in Detroit to take in a Tigers game and some other events. The ease of using the app, can see directly where I'm sitting, what my view looks like, especially helpful when I'd never been to Comerica before. GameTime made it easy to secure those tickets and feel good about the tickets that I was getting. They have flash deals, so you can save even more in the app with those exclusive deals ahead of the event, and the Game Time zone deals as well, where all you have to do is select the section and let Game Time choose the seats for you. Most importantly, though, as I mentioned, you can see your view from the seats and you see the all-in pricing as well. So there's no sticker shock when you get to that final checkout screen with all of those fees. Game Time eliminates that for you as well. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. All right, so we kind of got into a lot of it with, hey, what do the Bucks need to do this offseason? A lot of it's pretty obvious, right? You need to find some more athleticism. They need playmakers. They need guys that can create that offensively and defensively. You need it. Now, the caveat to add all that is, how are they going to do this when it's essentially veterans minimums that they have to dole out? Brian, you mentioned the guys that you would look at. Camille and I have talked about this before. The guys that are most likely to be moved are the same names that come up among fans: Brook Lopez, Bobby Portis, Pat Connaughton, if for no other reason than their contract status. Bobby, as you mentioned, up for an extension. You really extend him or you move him, as you pointed to, but also the size of the contract. Those are the tradable deals that the Bucks have. Frank has talked about this a little bit. The Bucks avoided the second apron this season. They are not going to do that next season. So in order to get anything other than veterans minimums to throw out there, you're going to have to theoretically move a Bobby Portis or a Brook Lopez and bring back maybe a one lesser deal in a draft pick or something like that. And then it's veterans minimums that you have to dole out. There are lists that are out there. I think it's still very early to get into who do the Bucks need to target. So knowing it's probably just going to be the minimums and taking trades out of it and who they could eventually bring in there, the type of player that the Bucks need to target with those veterans minimums, the first type of player that you would target would be what?
6'6", can shoot threes, very athletic, can play defense.
All defensive player.
Yeah, does that count? Yeah. No, I think that would be generally the type of player that Bucks got to get, is a perimeter defender that can start in the backcourt along Dame. I think that was one of their biggest missteps last year by getting, I shouldn't say getting Beasley for that role, but trying or asking Beasley to play that role when he had never played that role at any stage in his career. Like all of a sudden asking him to turn that on. He tried hard. Like that's the thing between trying hard and actually being good at defense. Like I thought he gave great effort. Like he was out there busting his butt, working hard. You can't fault him for the effort. But I would say that would be what I would put at the top. And I would even remove athleticism from that. Just somebody with better size and better perimeter defense, because you're going to have to cut corners somewhere, but somebody that can at least slow down the Halliburtons, the Brunsons, the Tyrese Maxeys, can at least maybe match up with Jason Tatum. Like, that's who the Bucks have to have in mind when they are signing these guys, is who's going to take on those matchups in the postseason. Like, those are all the teams that they're going to have to go through next year. Jimmy Butler, whatever team he ends up on, like, they need somebody who can at least get in their way and slow them down. This year, they didn't have that. I mean, Halliburton didn't have the best series, but Milwaukee had to put a lot of effort into slowing him down. So that's who I would target, because for me, that does a couple of things. Number one, helps with that, but then also allows them to hopefully bring back Pat Bev on a minimum. And then that knocks Beverly down a notch in the pecking order. I thought he was great, but he's going to be 36. You don't want him to be your primary defender. If he's your secondary guy, I think you're fine. But that's where I would start, is that wing defender, and kind of figure out the rest of that.
So not Joe Ingles if the Magic decline his option this season. And
he gives great effort out there. He's just slow as a turtle. I mean, that man, a traffic cone goes around that dude.
Yeah, people were mad about Brook. They do not want to see Joe Ingles back.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with you on, we've talked about it at length on this show with Malik, and I think the difficult part in analyzing Malik Beasley this season is, number one, what did you realistically expect on that end of the floor, when that's never been what you bring Malik Beasley on board for? And I just keep going back to that Damian Lillard trade. We heard from John Horst at the press conference when they announced the firing of Adrian Griffin, that their plans and expectations changed when they were able to get Damian Lillard. So with that in mind, it looks a lot better and different if Drew Holiday is starting next to Malik Beasley than Damian Lillard there. So that was one of those interesting things. And the Pat Beverly piece too, I think we talked about it on the last couple of shows of the Pacers series. I thought Pat Beverly was very good for this team, but it's kind of like the hockey analogy where you have also so many injuries, you're moving guys up a line, that your fourth line guys and third line guys are all of a sudden getting heavy minutes and playing on your first line. And that's basically what happened with Pat Beverly. I don't know if you saw, but apparently we're using pretty liberal usage of the word sweepstakes. The Bucks are the front runners to win the Pat Beverly sweepstakes this offseason, and Vegas even labeled them as the favorites to re-sign him. So in that sense, that's a good thing. And especially, as you pointed to, if you can bring in some more help around him and bigger guys in the backcourt, so it's not just Pat Beverly, and you can reduce his minutes as well. Because Camille, before you jump in here, I think the one other thing we should probably throw out there is what do you make of what we saw from guys' games played this season, that all of a sudden now we're seeing all these injuries pop up in the playoffs? Are the two correlated? Is it coincidental? Do you think we're going to see an overreaction next year where teams are going to say, Doc already kind of floated it out there, maybe we need to play Giannis fewer games and fewer minutes? Like, is that going to be the backlash to what we saw this season?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it was wild when the NBA came out with that conclusion that playing more doesn't have an impact on injuries. I mean, I think that's just goes against what common sense says, and goes against what all the science and data said before that. And I think, I don't have it in front of me, but the number of minutes that Giannis even played this year was higher.
We talked about it yesterday. Yeah, it was about 600 minutes higher than any year since before Bud arrived.
Yeah. And so I think that's like, if you can get him back to like that 30 minutes a game, that seems like a low number, but that's where he's thrived and was at least healthier in the postseason. But I do think that we'll see teams start to go back to injury management, load management, that kind of stuff, because what's the point of playing these guys on a Tuesday night in February if they're not going to be ready on a Saturday in April or May?
Yeah.
And real quick, I also wonder if the league, it sounds like, is going to announce their TV deals when the playoffs end. If we see a referendum on that, even from the league, of, okay, we got our deals, so we're going to change this to 72 games or something like that.
I hope not.
Yeah. I mean, I think they make more money now. Well, I would just guess that. That's just a complete
Well, I
guess.
mean, in terms of the player awards and the 67 game minimum, if the league takes a look at that and says, okay, we're actually going to change this. It's not 67 that you got to play in, or not 72. We're going to bump it back or remove it altogether, change it to 60 or something like that.
Yeah, I think they'll look at it because there's a player too who had played in I forget what award, but had played the requisite amount of games, but didn't hit that like 20-minute mark threshold.
Dante.
Yeah, because he had played like 4 or 5 games that didn't meet that threshold. He wasn't hurt, he just didn't play that many minutes.
Yeah. One more question I had for you, Brian, just as we wrap up here, thinking about the playoff run that the Bucks did have this year, another first round flame out for the Milwaukee Bucks. But Justin and I talked about how it felt different than when they lost to Miami in large part because of the injuries and so on and so forth. But from the Pacers series, what were some of your takeaways that you got about this team as we head into next season? Like, did you learn anything different about the Milwaukee Bucks based on what we saw in the first round series, even without Giannis?
I thought their fight was great. I think that maybe that's something that they were missing in the Miami series. But I thought like they went down swinging. They didn't have nearly the amount of talent in the end because of the injuries. And even when Dame came back, he was very limited. So I think that was good to see, is that Doc Rivers has that locker room. He has them engaged, which I worry about because Doc Rivers talks a lot to the media. And I feel like he throws his guys under the bus a lot. So that's something that I was worried about even that short time of like, oh, is he going to lose this locker room again? Like just openly talking about it. But they battled hard. I think they did find some strands of success as far as Chris Middleton, how he can operate, even when it was just him. They're running a lot of action and getting him the ball, on the second side or after a ball swing. And so I think that's really where he's going to thrive next year, is playing off of Dame and Giannis. He's not going to be hopefully he's not the first option. Something went horribly wrong again if he's the first option. No shade to him, but I think that's another thing, is they got Middleton going. Mm-hmm. I kind of hope it's like that 2016-17 season for Middleton, where he had tore his hamstring, was out for like 6 months, came back at the end of the year, had just a decent year, but that really springboarded him for the next season. So I hope that's what we're seeing, is Middleton finished the season at least healthy from like a knee standpoint, right? Just had those ankles. So that's kind of what I'm hoping will happen, is Bucks will carry that fight over. Chris Middleton will springboard into next season, and then there'll be no injuries.
That's what we all hope for. But I think the big things are what we mentioned. That big three, is as solid as it gets, and especially what we saw from Chris in that series. It made it even more unfortunate that there's no Giannis, because seeing that and seeing Dame in those first 2 games showed you, okay, this works. It's just the pieces around them that you need to fill in. And that's where this offseason is going to be very, very interesting for the Bucks to see the types of facelifts that we could potentially see coming to this team. You can follow Brian on Twitter at Bucks Film Room. The podcast as well, Brian, the Bucks Film Room podcast. It's just Bucks Film Room.
Yep, just Bucks Film Room podcast.
And Brian is coming to us from a spot that is very near and dear to my heart in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Last thing too, I see a ton of people at games in the media that are looking at your account and referencing things that you've said. Marcus Johnson, probably the most notable one. I can't tell you how many times I've heard him mention, I saw Bucks Film Room mention this. Just real quick, how did this all come about? How did you get started in this?
Yeah, just grew up a big fan of basketball, obviously played basketball, and then just wanted a hobby, something to do and make, just to kind of get more interested into the game, especially when Giannis was starting to become big. Like, always a huge Bucks fan, but like recognizing this is a once in a lifetime player that we're going to have here. And how can I capitalize on that just from my fanhood as far as getting into the game as much as possible? So just slowly started to dive more and more into the game, learn about it more and more, talk with a lot of coaches around this area too, and guys who have some experience or have dabbled around around the NBA and just continuing to learn and stay curious. So I think has just kind of grown that way organically, and just something that I've loved to do is just spend time, rewatching those games, learning about why players do what they do. Cause I think that's one thing of like, everything is done with a purpose, right? There's nothing that's random in a basketball game. There's always a purpose, whether we agree with the purpose or not. Even playing random is done with a purpose, right? To keep defenses off guard. So I think just learning about that has been a fun journey.
I'm glad you mentioned you talk with coaches in that region too, because people will scoff and laugh at like, well, what do you learn from a high school coach? In that you learn so much stuff from high school coaches. And look, NBA coaches, not Doc Rivers, but Bud and all these other guys, where do you think they got started? They were a graduate assistant or something. They had a connection with a high school coach, and it all boils down to that. The fundamentals that you learned there, we're all taking those principles and just tweaking them slightly. So it's all out there, and you can find anywhere to learn that, and especially having those conversations with coaches and learning, okay, why do you guys do this? How do you combat this? How's the fastest way to slow one of these things down? Those are all the best ways to learn. Any final thoughts from you here, Camille?
I just want to say thank you to Brian for coming on the pod. Like Justin mentioned, other media personalities looking into your tweets and everything. Like, you've been one of my favorite accounts since you came on the scene. So definitely appreciate you spending the time and going through film and trying to make not only yourself smarter in the sport of basketball, but everybody who follows you and interacts with your page a bit smarter about the game of basketball from the X's and O's standpoint, because a lot of people watch the game, but they don't necessarily understand the game. So the more accounts that we have and more people who can really explain it just makes us all better. So thank you for that. And thank you for coming on Locked On Bucks.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
All right. Well, Camille and I will be back once again tomorrow and see what other type of news will break. We had the Pat Beverly sweepstakes news coming our way this afternoon. So what else can come out there tomorrow, and to start to wrap our heads around this offseason for the Bucks. So for Camille, for Brian, I'm Justin. You've been listening and watching Locked On Bucks. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow.